Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Adweek webinar, The Risks and Opportunities of Data Sharing, Mind the Privacy Gap, sponsored by Helios Data. I'm Melissa Ward, Managing Editor of Branded Content at Adweek, and I'll be your host today. Before we begin, I want to take a few minutes to make sure everyone knows what to expect from today's webinar and is familiar with the features of our platform. The actual presentation should go somewhere in the 30-minute range, after which we'll have time for audience Q&A. So if at any point you have a question for our speakers, just use the Q&A tool on the left side of your screen, and we'll get to as many questions as we can after the end of our live presentation. Also, it's not too late to invite your colleagues to join us for today. About 15 minutes ago, you received a final reminder email from us. In there, you'll find a link to the webinar registration page, and you can share that with your colleagues. There's still plenty of time for them to join us live, but if they can't, we understand. Today's webinar is being recorded, and they can always watch the on-demand version. In fact, the on-demand recording is available to all of our registrants. We'll be sending you a link later today when it's live, around 3:30 p.m. Eastern. And if you'd like a PDF of today's slide deck, you'll find it in the Event Resources tab at the top of your screen. As always, if you enjoyed today's webinar, definitely check out the full Adweek webinars calendar at adweek.com/webinars. You'll see what we have coming up, and you'll also get access to our archive of on-demand webinars. Now, before we jump into our presentation, let me introduce to you today's speakers. We're happy to be joined by Andy Hepburn, Director of Strategic Markets at Helios Data. Andy is an attorney and privacy expert with in-depth knowledge of the ad tech ecosystem, and he helps companies adapt to data privacy challenges that they face today. We're also joined by Steve Troyer, Head of Marketing and Business Development at Helios Data. Steve is an accomplished executive with over 25 years of go-to-market experience in networking, cybersecurity, and data analytics markets. We have some great content to dive into today. So first, let me bring everybody up on screen, and I'm going to hand it off to Steve.
Great. Thank you, and welcome for joining us for the session where we'll explore the dangers of personal data sharing and for data providers and their partners. We're going to look out beyond just legal contracts as protection mechanisms. We will also talk about the opportunities and how new technologies like digital contracts and confidential compute enclaves can play a role in eliminating these gaps and making data sharing safe and productive in a world made more dangerous by new laws and as well as bad actors. So throughout my career in data and security, most security teams have done a great job and succeeded in making personal and proprietary data both good enough and also secure enough for usage. But safe enough and good enough gets harder with rules tightening and analytic requirements changing, becoming more creative and rigorous. But the big question today is how do we close the most challenging of the gaps, which is really the data while it's in use. To help us with that today, we have a real treat. Our guest is Andy Hepburn. Andy is our new Strategic Market Director for Advertising. Andy's an attorney with his own firm, Neo Law, focused on privacy law issues. Who better to help out to understand the gap? I'd like to welcome Andy. Please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Steve. And hello, everyone. Again, it's Andy Hepburn, and I've been practicing law for over 30 years in primarily in technology companies, and with a focus on data and privacy compliance, especially in more recent years. So, especially in the last 9 years, it's been in advertising technology companies. And my last job before opening my law firm was as the general counsel of Seismic, which was an ad serving platform and demand side platform that's now owned by Amazon. So that's my background. I do it all day, every day, working on contracts around data and data sharing and data protection. So that's my bona fides for this talk.
Great. So let's dive into this privacy gap that we've described here. Written contracts have been with us since ancient times, and whether they were clay tablets or now ASCII characters in Microsoft Word, they seem to have endured and will obviously be around for a long time. But they've been sort of the go-to technology until now. We have master contracts and exhibits and orders and data processing agreements and all of that. Can you expand on that a little bit, Andy?
Sure. So, I think for the purposes of this conversation, where we're going to talk as we go along about digital contracts, I think it's helpful to create the context for what a contract is, and we're going to use some examples from ad tech. So we'll talk about data sharing agreements. So the first thing is, just so we're all in agreement on what a contract is it's a legally enforceable agreement between two or more parties. That's what a contract is. And they can be done as handshakes. So I can say, "Hey, Steve, will you cut my grass if I pay you $25?" And we can shake on that. And that's a contract, and it's legally enforceable, but it's really hard to enforce, because who's going to prove it if there wasn't a witness to say, yeah, they actually agreed on that. And that's why contracts are written, is because the proof to prove that a contract is in force and hasn't been breached or has been breached needs to be in some sort of demonstrable evidence. So the thing about contracts is every contract includes promises to cut the grass and to pay for that service, or whatever the case may be. And I think it's worth kind of, I said it's a legally enforceable agreement. So if we change that scenario and say, "Hey, Steve, will you sell me some crystal meth for $25? And you say, "Sure. And I don't pay you the $25, but I take the crystal meth. Can you enforce that agreement?" Well, the answer is no. That's not a contract. It's not a legally enforceable contract. There might be other methods that someone might use to try to enforce that agreement. But it's not legally enforceable, because the law doesn't recognize the right to sell crystal meth to me and others. So the thing about that, I make that point because it's important to understand that one of the key features of every contract is that it has remedies if the contract is not adhered to, if there's a breach of contract. And those remedies, typically the way they work is, if we talk about data sharing agreements, for example, I agree to share some data and someone agrees to pay me money for the data they receive. What's the remedy if that contract is not adhered to? Well, typically the remedy is the right to sue the breaching party and to get damages, what you agreed to pay in this case. So it's important to note that contracts have to be legally enforceable, and they always have remedies if the contract is not followed by one of the parties. And that's where you get into questions about, well, is the remedy enough in a world where data is flying all over the world as fast as we can generate it? And the issue is, just to preview things, is that the remedies that contracts afford, sue the other party in court, they're very reactive. You're not going to take that step unless the issue's really bad. And so there's a growing gap where you need enforcement short of filing a lawsuit to make the remedies work in the favor of the party that has them. So let me stop there and just and see if there are any follow-up questions, Steve, that you want me to, or things you want me to address.
So I think if to summarize it, the legal contract is about trust, and then there's some verification that goes on with that trust, and
trust but verify, as the old saying goes.
Exactly. But tell me about this gap that we talked about. What that we need to mind now that high-speed data sharing for advertising and digital marketing is there. That may feel new, but is there anything really different required here?
Yeah, so let me also just say, for context, we'll use the example of a data sharing agreement. And what that is in the advertising space is for digital ads served. We have an audience here served onto your browser or into your phone or even onto your TV. Those are enabled by data sharing agreements. And what a data sharing agreement does is it's a publisher, so a website publisher, goes to the advertisers who want to advertise on that publisher's site and says, look, I'm going to share some information, some data with you about the audience that comes to my website. And then you can bid on the right to serve an ad onto my website or in various web pages and so forth. And so the data sharing agreement describes what the data is that the publisher is going to share with that advertiser who's buying it. And then what are the rights of the advertiser to use that data beyond just the purpose of serving the ad. So most data sharing agreements have a clause that says, okay, advertiser, I'm going to sell you some data and you can use it to buy an ad on my site, but you can't use it for anything else. You can't share it with anyone else. You can't supplement it with your own data to make your own audience for ad targeting or so other purposes. You have very restrictive terms about what the advertiser and their intermediaries, their service providers, can do with the data that's being shared. So you ask, well, what is the gap? And this is it, is that right now, website publishers, digital publishers, have a real issue with that. They have contracts that say, here's the data, here's what you can and can't do with it, but they're having a problem with enforcement. People are not adhering to those restrictive terms. And so they're having what they describe in the digital publishing world, they describe it as data leakage. So what do? Well, you have this contract and it says, if you don't do what we agreed around data sharing, I can sue you. Well, the problem is you don't really want to sue your customer unless something has seriously gone wrong. So there's a disincentive to actually use the remedies that the contract affords. But the other problem is once your data is out the door and once it's being abused and misused, it's kind of you've opened Pandora's box and the data can't be recovered in an easy fashion. It's hard to track the data and where it's gone and who's using it. So there are a lot of issues around how do I actually have a remedy if something goes wrong and my partner's not using the data properly? What is my remedy? Do I really want to sue them in court? And so that's the gap, is a contract is important. And those remedies for really severe cases are also important, the right to sue. But short of that, you're really left with, in many cases around digital data, with a lack of remedies to stop the problem from occurring altogether, or to address it in real time if you see a problem happening with the use of your data. So that's the gap, is that gap between the ability to enforce remedies, in real time versus what the contract affords, which is sue your partner because they're not doing what we've agreed on. So yeah, I mean that's it. The gap is lack of real time and effective remedies short of suing people that you're in business with.
Right. So you've got this usage risk. I think we'll introduce that concept. It's not like it's something new. It's always been there. Why is it starting? Why are we talking about it now as a discrete source of risk?
Well, so yeah, I mean it's been, the problem has been around forever. I read recently that Shakespeare had a play called Cardenio. No one knows about that because someone stole it. So the issue around people taking data and using it inappropriately has been around for a long time. Anybody in the audience that's dealt with any contracts, at all knows about non-disclosure agreements. Those have been around for decades, hundreds of years. So it's not really, usage risk is not really a new concept. But what is new is the proliferation of data and its value in the marketplace. So I like to say data is the new gold. It's the unit of transaction value in a lot of commercial relationships. And because digital data can be copied and proliferated, extremely easily and in real time, it's harder to track. It's a much broader problem. It's a real-time problem. There's a whole host of issues around the real-time nature of transacting in in digital data. And then the other thing is it's easier to get your hands on it when you're transacting data across the internet. So there's increased risk of hacking, increased risk of misuse of personal information of individuals. And so this has given rise to, a really significant increase in the last 10 years, but I would say especially in the last 5 years, of privacy laws that are trying to address misuse of individuals' personal information, and trying to get companies to take more care with it. So a lot of these privacy laws are focused on, Helios data or Microsoft or Tesla or whomever. They're all collecting personal information from users. And the issue is the risks around using that data are greater than they used to be, because the bad actors, the criminals of the world, have realized if they can get that data in quantities, they can sell it and make profit off of it. And so there's a lot of increased criminal activity around data use in the world right now. The final thing I wanted to say about that, why it's become more important, is the stakes are higher than they used to be. So, example is the GDPR, which is the European and United Kingdom data protection law for individuals. It has fines in it. So if you don't follow the requirements of GDPR, you can be fined up to 20 million euros or 4% of your annual revenue. And there are some significant judgments coming out of Europe right now for companies that are not properly taking care of people's personal information. Another example is in 2020, Marriott paid nearly $24 million in fines and restitution for a data breach that they caused that could have been prevented by better data management and data governance processes.
Great, thanks, Andy. So with the legal agreement about trust and this verification issue, partners have used various tools like audits to do that. But the audit is typically sometime out in the future. So getting back to your point about real time, the need is to have some kind of real time verification there. So how have companies up until now scrambled to address this issue about usage risk?
Yeah, so I mean, first thing to note is there is a lot of scrambling. It's a lot of it's around compliance with these new laws, but also just an increased awareness by companies that personal information, it's valuable and it needs to be protected. And so companies in general, I would say there's a higher awareness and a higher concern with properly protecting personal individuals' information. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of contracts being signed between buyers and sellers of data or users of data. A lot of dollars being spent on better protection mechanisms, so hardening information security capabilities in networks and that sort of thing, increased use of encryption. There's a lot happening, but still the problem persists. So, I think that's the issue is some of these measures, they're important and they need to happen, but they don't really address this issue of, how do I detect that I have a data usage problem or a data leakage problem? And how do I stop it if it's going on? What is the method to do that? And that's where I think we can start talking about digital contracts and how they enhance and supplement traditional written contracts. Yeah, I mean, there's plenty. I mean, there are plenty of methods out there. There's de-identification of data is a technique for making it less harmful if it leaks. If it's in one instance, it's identified to an individual person. In the next instance, it's de-identified. The harm of it getting out there unintentionally is less. And then anonymization is another technique that companies are using. And as I said, encryption, there's a lot of methods out there that are being used to better protect and manage sensitive data.
So these technologies have always been the go-to for protecting data being used. Obfuscation technologies like anonymization, data masking, encryption technologies like differential privacy or homomorphic encryption. These are a bit of a crutch. Maybe you can talk a little bit about why, say, anonymization is problematic.
Well, I mean, from a lawyer's perspective, one of the things that, you don't have to read very much about these techniques to know that as a matter of computational capabilities, de-identification and anonymization, and even to some extent encryption, so I would say de-identification and anonymization. The problem is that they're difficult to rely on from a legal perspective, because studies are showing that these are serious academic studies showing that with one little piece of additional information, it's not that hard to re-identify a data set to an individual. And so the issue is they don't always work. It's hard to make identified data de-identified permanently, or identified data anonymized permanently. So that's one important issue. The other is a commercial issue, is the more you de-identify the data and anonymize the data, in many respects, it's that identification to an individual that's useful, both for the individual and for a business trying to sell to them. And so the further you abstract the data, the less value it has, the less utility it has in really providing unique and individualized solutions to consumers.
Great. So we've discussed legal contracts and what I think the industry calls privacy enhancing technologies. Why don't we prepare them from the perspective of partners looking to eliminate risk, minimize cost, and maximize the business value of the data that they share. First, traditional legal contracts are really good at establishing conditions for data use, but they're not actionable, they're reactive, and they can't prevent these violations, eliminate usage risk, or immunize a data controller from privacy violations and their implications. The legacy PEC or privacy enhanced computation methods are also a common approach. These PECs provide certain operational protections which reduce risk and liability. But as you mentioned, they can limit the use cases for the data, the value of the data, and also from a cost perspective, they introduce high computational costs, and they introduce these new risks like de-identification that you mentioned. So they don't really provide data controllers with any visibility or control over the data. So you mentioned digital contracts, Andy, also known as smart contracts. Fundamentally, just reputations of a legal agreement encoded in software. Can you talk about what they are and also address those operational requirements you described before? I mean, take a step back and legally, what even is a digital contract?
So, conceptually, a digital contract, like you said, it's no different than a written contract or a handshake agreement, except that, so it's a set of promises between two parties around a legally enforceable, topic, like sharing, selling data, whatever the case may be. So it's all of that, but it's represented in software code. And so then the question is, well, why does that matter? What is the advantage of taking a contract and representing it in software code? And the advantage is the software can do more. Like, if I share a contract with you, you can read, do not share my data with third parties. But how do you manage that? Well, so the written contract has the audit clause, and it has remedies if you violate that obligation. But the software can monitor the behaviors in real time. So it can monitor what data is coming into that digital contract, what data or what processing is happening around that data once it's in this digital contract. What are the outputs from it, and who's it being shared with, and all of these things. These are all really important capabilities that a paper contract doesn't give you. So it just really, I think it's important to focus. It's not either or, it's both, because, a written contract will say both parties have to comply with applicable laws. Well, that's not really something it's too generic to represent in software code. But one of those laws might be you can't share data with third parties without consent. Well, that process of obtaining the consent of the data owner to sharing it with a third party can be represented in software code. And so it really helps to enhance the written contract by creating monitorable promises that are represented in the code. So I think that's kind of, and it gives you some ability to enforce the contract in real time. So if it's written in code, the code can detect when compliance problems have occurred and maybe stop the data sharing from occurring altogether, at least until things can be worked out and resolved.
Great. Can you comment a little bit on the kind of data that can be shared, what kind of terms around that, and maybe some examples of components that can be addressed?
Yeah, so I'm using the example of a data sharing agreement. So in the ad tech industry, what companies want to do, advertisers want to do, is they want to deliver an ad to an interested buyer, to an interested person. And I'm a huge fan of coffee. So companies that sell coffee, like I have multiple Keurig machines in my house, they might want to reach me online. Right. So what ad tech, the whole digital advertising industry, is focused on enabling advertisers to reach interested buyers. And so in order to do that, the data that's shared with an advertiser is the publisher of a website says, hey, I'm a coffee site. I get tons of interested coffee, aficionados coming to my website. Wouldn't you like to sell an ad here? And so the companies, the Keurigs and their competitors, are bidding on selling an ad on that ad space on that website. So that's an example. There's data about users, about me, flowing down to potential advertisers who may be interested in servicing me. And it's not just the Keurigs of the world, but you might infer that if I love coffee, maybe I love beer. You might infer. So there are other advertisers that say, coffee, like most really like focused coffee lovers, they also love beer. So you might get beer advertisers trying to sell onto this website. So it's a value exchange between, I get really qualified viewers on my coffee website. And so the advertiser might pay a premium if they know they're going to reach the right audience there. So that's the example in data sharing around digital advertising. But there's data sharing, think about in healthcare, between healthcare providers and hospitals and insurance companies and so forth. Really significant data sharing challenges in that space. In financial industry, we got to protect that data at all costs. So again, really significant challenges around not only sharing the data, but monitoring it and managing it if things are going wrong.
Great. So these digital contracts can help close this gap. This would probably work better in combination with some kind of secure computing solution or a location. People have called these clean rooms. We will call it a secure enclave. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, so the more you can control the environment where the data sharing is occurring. And this is like, one of the examples I can use as a lawyer is when you do an acquisition, when a company buys another company, one of the first things that happens is the company that's selling itself goes and creates a data room that has all the information that potential buyers might want to see to decide how much they want to pay, if they want to bid at all. And so that's an example of a clean room where a lot of really sensitive corporate data gets stored so that potential buyers have to be qualified and allowed entrance and sign up and agree to some rules about what they will and won't do with that data. So that's an example of where a secure enclave exists, and those have been used for a long time. when I started practicing law, they were actual physical rooms that you would walk into. There'd be a bunch of files in there, and you couldn't walk out with any files. You had to do your work in the room. So we're way past that now. So there's digital rooms, and that's a secure enclave is actually a more real-time created clean room that has a lot more flexibility and capability around it than these physical rooms that I used to work in when I was a young lawyer.
Great. So in Helios Data's secure data sharing platform, the digital contracts kind of govern this processing inside a secure enclave. Let's take a look at how this works. The parties create the contract, and they use a simple and logical workflow for that, which is mostly taking the terms that are in the written contract and extracting them and converting them into digital form. The contract now governs the access to the activity within what we call this trusted collaboration container, or TCC, which is the secure enclave, which works in conjunction with the digital contract. And inside that's where the data gets decrypted. Within the TCC, the data are processed in clear text and eliminate the need for data masking or other anonymization techniques. And those, as we mentioned earlier, can distort the data or their resulting insights. We don't offer algorithms or data, so we're a neutral venue for all the parties involved. While the TCC is open, the parties establish and test the algorithm with sample data to establish the algorithm's unique digital fingerprint. And by enabling specific data usage controls up front, they set the controls for which specific aspects of the data insights to share. When the TCC closes and the execution starts, the data is decrypted and the algorithm processes the data set exactly as it's programmed and agreed to. So at every phase, each party has visibility to their own IP or data via these real-time audit metrics. That's where we talk about this real-time verification for the trust that's inherent in that contract. Here is where the usage risk problem is solved if even a single contract term is violated or the algorithm somehow deviates from the established fingerprint. The digital contract detects it, shuts the TCC down in real time, and the TCC is dissolved with both the data and the algorithm destroyed, so everything is secure. And throughout that process, the data was never at risk. Valuable insights that were needed were created and they were exchanged. So, Andy, comments? Oh.
Sorry. Yeah. So, I mean, I think this is kind of, the thing that woke me up is I deal all day long with companies that are, really concerned about, well, we're signing these contracts that say, don't do this, don't do that with our data. But once it's out the door, we don't really know what's happening. And it's hard for us. And we can't afford to go audit 100 companies and see what they're doing with our data. It's a challenge. It's a really challenging thing. So, I mean, I think that's where this, what you've exhibited there, Steve, is potentially extremely helpful, is where you can manage the data sharing. And oftentimes, your partner doesn't actually need the data. They need a result. They need something done with the data that gives them an insight or an output that is really why they need the data in the first place. And so having all of that done inside a secure enclave where you have control over how the data is being processed, what's being done with it, with whom it's being shared, and can actually stop problems when you see them in real time through alerts and all sorts of things. It really is potentially changing the game in terms of actual data protection capabilities using solutions like this.
Great. So as discussed earlier, only the contract-governed, zero trust-based confidential computing represented by secure data sharing at Helios Data, only that allows you to share data completely safely with high governance, low risk, and the usability that's required. So we've really pioneered a truly unique and rigorous approach that enables companies to provide full data and use security, so you can build, run, and extract value from data sharing for growth. Before we get into the Q&A, let's summarize some of the key points here. So legal contracts leave these big gaps. They're reactive and respond to risks. They don't prevent it. Usage risk is sort of the great unmet frontier, and alternative technologies like privacy enhanced computing can protect data in a few ways, but they also eliminate usability, and they introduce additional risks like de-identification and re-identification. And from a cost perspective, they add computational costs and have a limited use cases. Digital contracts provide one aspect of the answer, but Helios Data has integrated the digital contract with the secure enclave, and that has created full data in use processing security and completed the solution there. So at Helios Data, we can talk to you about how to close the gap, renew your sharing of data safely, and also grow that productively with our secure data sharing platform using digital contracts for this protected enclave. Just a little bit of background on the company, and then we'll get to the Q&A. We're a startup company based in Silicon Valley. We've got global customers who need to eliminate risk of data sharing so they can grow their revenue and business value through digital transformation. We resolve these customer problems using our secure data sharing platform and in partnership with our customers and business partners. We also have a monthly newsletter and a monthly webinar series in which you can subscribe to on our website. You can use our solution in a basic level of service. We offer that at no cost and give you a chance to try it out with your existing data sharing arrangements. And we feel customers will be so satisfied with the protection, cost, and usability that you'll expand your data sharing project capacity like most of our customers have today. So let's move back now to Melissa for the Q&A.
Thanks so much. Excuse me. Thank you so much, Andy and Steve. That was a really wonderful and in-depth presentation. So we do have some time for questions, but before we dive into them, make sure that you use the Q&A tool. It's going to be found on the left side of your screen. That's how we're going to get those questions from you. We're going to get to as many of them as we can over the next 5 to 10 minutes. But if we don't get your question, we always make sure they get forwarded over to our sponsor so they have an opportunity to possibly reply offline. But first, just a couple quick reminders I always like to share. Today's webinar has been recorded and it will be available on demand later this afternoon. We'll be emailing everyone a link to the recording. And if you want a copy of today's slides, you'll find a PDF in the event resources area at the top of your screen. So let's jump into some of these questions. Okay, so the first question I have is, can you compare relative costs of different approaches?
Sure, I'll take that, Melissa. So there's a number of cost components, and I think that one thing that Andy mentioned, which is crucial here, is to understand that we're not going to replace a legal contract. A legal contract is a firm basis for all kinds of data sharing protection and is the basis for the digital contract element in our solution. But the cost categories that to consider are, the liabilities that are encountered by a company if there is a data breach, the fines, the settlements, that come from the laws and the global mandates, things like GDPR or CCPA. The damage to your business reputation or the valuation. And then there, software licensing costs for the solution. And then another important thing to consider is audit costs. Audits in these big annual or less frequent audit cycles tend to be very expensive. They also take your system offline for a period of time. So there's a huge opportunity cost associated with it. And so the legal contract is the very basic approach with just the legal contract and a lot of risk and very high costs if any of these risks become realities. The performance or privacy and enhanced computing technologies like differential privacy or potentially encryption technologies, they kind of lower that risk a little bit with the data because they do offer some protection, but there's high cost in the computation that goes with that. And in addition to that, you lower the usability so that the data actually becomes devalued for those approaches. So with the Helios data and the secure data sharing, we have the lowest risk component there because we've closed that gap and also don't have high computational costs and provide the greatest usability for the data. So now we've got the greatest value there. So that kind of gives you a basic comparison there.
Great. Andy, you commented on the remedy problem just recently. I wonder how the detection and validation of usage violation is done today with the legal contract-based framework.
So the answer is there's a variety of inputs into that, but what the contract says is if we detect a breach or a misuse of data, we have the right to stop it. Well, how do you do that? Well, you go to court and get an injunction. Courts aren't open right now because of COVID. Getting a lawyer to take your case and go file paperwork in the courtroom, it's going to cost you $20,000 just to get started. But the contract also says, well, if we detect a problem, we can audit. So it allows for a right to send in auditors, look at systems, look at information, look at data, do a forensic analysis, so forth and so on. Again, a fairly manual, slow, people-based process. And then, finally, there are technology solutions that companies employ in their networks and in their computing infrastructures that can detect some kinds of anomalies. But often, it's around people trying to breach the network, and that sort of thing is where those are focused.
Great. I've got another one. This is a nice long question, so we're going to work on our listening skills because it is very involved. So, if enforcement of the digital contract is a function of two or more parties' conversion from traditional contract to digital, testing its behavior, what happens if the party's traditional contract has an exposure that both parties are not aware of before it is converted? I feel like I just asked an SAT question.
Sounds like a law school question to me.
Yeah, no, actually, you're right. Yeah.
If it is a law school question, I'm going to hand that one to Andy.
So I think if I understood, the question is, so let's say you adopt a digital contract, and ideally you're not doing this, on the fly, because once you have the written contract, if you didn't work it out with your partner to say, hey, we're going to implement this digital contract capability that's going to create a secure enclave, and your algorithm and my data are going to go in there and get processed, that's the way this is set up. So it's a little harder to do it after the fact. But if you can get over that hurdle and get the digital contract in place, what you're doing is, and the way you would do it if you were trying to retrofit a digital contract is say, the contract says I can audit. This is an audit function. And so I'm going to try to convince my partner that they need to agree to this. But I'm also going to try to convince them that, look, what I'm trying to do is help you not have a breach of our terms that goes on for a long time and metastasizes, so that you end up with a lot of liability to us that we could have stopped in the first place using a secure contract or a digital contract.
Yeah, I think the other thing I would add to that is that if there is something that comes up that's not addressed in the original written contract, and it's flagged, and let's say that the terms of that contract are that the contract can be updated with new issues from time to time. These digital contracts can also be a living piece of software and a living enforcement, so that you can stop from time to time, change that, improve the enforceability of the agreement by adding terms as needed.
Yeah, and a lot of contracts do, especially around information security, because that's a constantly evolving discipline where things improve over time. A lot of contracts allow for updates to further secure the data or whatever's going on.
Great. So I have one last question. Can you explain what you mean by computationally expensive?
Great. I will, for folks who are less techie, and I'm not a techie, but the best way to analogize that is you probably, everybody's familiar with Bitcoin, right? Well, Bitcoin, there's a process to mine Bitcoin that uses computing processors. Sometimes they use even specialized computing processors, a GPU, because of the breaking the encryption and the blockchain algorithm is required, and so that type of computing capability is required for very what we would call computational expensive. You might not necessarily need GPUs in the case of Bitcoin, but you need more and more processing in a cloud environment, more and more RAM. That drives up the cost of the overall protection capability. So that's really what's required. And it also restricts another downside of that is it restricts the type of calculations that can be done. And it can also result in lost data, results that can't be generated. So you've changed the data underlying that will be used, and that data is now degraded or devalued. So that's one additional cost that's not always considered when you look at computationally expensive solutions.
Great. Wonderful. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for questions. I'd like to thank our speakers as well as our sponsor, Helios Data. Some final reminders: make sure you download the slides from event resources and check your email for a link to the on-demand recording. And if you enjoyed today's webinar, please check out the Adweek webinar calendar at adweek.com/webinars. Again, thank you to our speakers. Thank you to our audience for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing everyone at an upcoming Adweek webinar. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you very much.